People imagine castles as grand, stone giants with banners, torches, feasting halls, and the soft glow of chivalry flickering behind stained glass. Which is curious, because at night, the only thing flickering in most medieval castles was the candlelight trembling beside a rat hole. The truth is this: surviving a night inside a medieval castle took more creativity than bravery, more tolerance than armor, and an unsettling amount of familiarity with damp wool. Forget the dragons and noble lords. Castle nights were less about epic quests and more about not freezing to death on a flea-infested mattress while someone snored aggressively 6 inches from your ear. Night began early in the Middle Ages. By winter, dusk fell around 4 in the afternoon. The last rays of daylight crept through narrow arrow slits, called lancet windows if you want to sound fancy, casting long shadows across the stone floors. There was no warm evening glow here. The walls swallowed light and spat back drafts. A bell might ring in the inner ward, or a horn might sound. Each castle had its customs. Servants rushed to finish their duties, nobles retreated from the chill of the courtyards, and gates groaned shut behind tired guards. The castle became a sealed world, protected from outside threats and utterly vulnerable to everything inside. Let's begin inside the keep, the central tower, the supposedly safest and warmest part of the structure. A few torches hiss against the damp stone walls. The air is thick with smoke and the scent of burnt tallow. Somewhere in the stairwell, someone coughs, once, twice. You can hear every footstep, every door latch, every stomach growling beneath layers of linen and pride. If you were noble, you might retire to your solar, a private upper chamber for your family, often placed just above the Great Hall. But private in the medieval sense didn't mean quiet or comfortable. It meant slightly less crowded than the rest of the building and only marginally warmer than the courtyard. These rooms were still stone boxes, poorly insulated and full of echoes. The furniture was heavy and few: a bed, likely a wooden frame with ropes across the base, layered with a feather mattress if you were lucky, or straw ticking if you were realistic, woolen blankets, fur if available, and if you had the foresight, a canopy with thick curtains. Not for style, for heat. According to a 14th century inventory from the Château de Vincennes, the bed of a minor nobleman included a frame of oak, 4 curtains, a mattress of straw, a bolster of down, 2 blankets, and a fox fur covering. That fox, one suspects, did not die peacefully, and yet it was cold, unforgivingly cold. The hearth in the corner of the room gave off heat only if it was kept fed, which meant someone, usually a servant, had to tend it well into the night. And most servants had other things to do, like sleep. Nobles often woke to find their chamber temperature had dropped to something between unpleasant and "is this pneumonia?" Then there was the wind. Castles were built for defense, not comfort. Their walls were thick, their windows narrow, and their corridors curved for military advantage. That meant air currents funneled through the stone like breath through a flute. Any room without a hanging tapestry or wooden paneling was essentially a medieval wind tunnel. The floors, made of cold stone or uneven timber, leached heat through your soles. Slippers were prized. Socks were layered. If you dropped something at night, you left it. Now let's descend a social tier, to the garrison or servants' quarters. Because if noble nights were cold and restless, common ones were crowded and alive with noise. Servants slept where they worked: kitchens, hallways, stables, even stairwells. Pallets of straw were rolled out at night and stacked in the morning. No one had their own space. Sleep was communal. So were fleas. Privacy was rare, and so was quiet. If someone snored, you dealt with it. If someone stole your blanket, you stole it back or froze. And if someone died in the night, which happened, it was dealt with discreetly before breakfast. In one rather blunt entry from a 13th century household account at Windsor Castle, it's noted that a servant named Ewan expired after the 3rd frost, and was moved to the outer yard before the cook's bell. That's it. No flourish. Just logistics. But for all that discomfort, what truly made medieval castle nights mysterious wasn't the cold. It was the dark. We've forgotten what true darkness feels like. No ambient streetlights, no glowing phone screens, no clocks, no hums, no nightlights. just the smothering black of thick stone walls and shuttered windows, pierced only by firelight. It didn't flicker so much as sway, uneasy in the draft. Shadows bloomed and died on the ceiling. People imagined things in that blackness, and with good reason. The medieval world believed in night spirits, demons, and creeping death. The dark was when the soul was weakest, when illness struck hardest, when sin whispered loudest. Many slept with crosses or charms. Some scribbled prayers on parchment and tucked them under pillows. According to one record from the monastic community at Cluny, several monks refused to sleep without a candle burning beside them, to ward off the malice of the unseen. The castle chapel might even be visited at night, not for comfort, but for protection. But the danger wasn't always spiritual. Chamber pots had to be emptied, usually by servants, often not until morning, which meant nighttime odors fermented slowly and steadily, particularly in rooms without chimneys. In some castles, pots were stored in cupboard-like garderobes built into the wall, where the waste dropped into a pit below. In theory. In practice, those pits backed up. Frequently, and the warmth from nearby fires often wafted the results directly into sleeping quarters. Some castles used dried herbs, lavender, mint, wormwood, to line their garderobes, not for hygiene, for camouflage. The castle of Warkworth in Northumberland had such a system, with stone chutes running down into the moat. The moat was less than fragrant, and still people slept, eventually. Wrapped in cloaks, pressed against dogs, tucked beneath drapery. Sleep came in short, anxious waves. The wealthy were better off, but not by much. The poor got used to aching backs and shared breath. Sleep was a necessity, not a pleasure. Some guards stayed awake through the night, especially in times of tension. They walked the battlements with torches, their boots scraping stone, watching for trouble that rarely came, but always might. They wrapped themselves in furs and drank heavily. It helped, a little. So how did they survive? With layers, with routine, with superstition and shared body heat, and the knowledge that, with any luck, dawn would come again. They didn't think of it as survival. It was just night. You endured it like bad stew or church penance. And maybe that's the mystery. Not that they survived it once, but that they did it every night, for years. Without mattresses, without heat, without quiet. And still rose to do it all again. By the middle of the night, the castle doesn't sleep. It simmers, not with noise necessarily, but with a strange layered tension. The kind that comes from too many people trapped inside too few stone rooms, with too many unspoken fears, and nowhere else to go. This is the hour when reality blurs, not because of dreams, but because of fatigue, firelight, and the way cold makes time fold in on itself. Let's start with the guards. Not the ceremonial knights in gleaming armor, but the watchmen who trudged the battlements in woolen cloaks, gripping sputtering torches and muttering curses under their breath. They moved slowly, boots dragging on wet stone, stopping at each lookout post to peer into the dark. Not much to see, of course, just the void beyond the outer wall, fields or forests blanketed in mist or snow, and the occasional flicker of distant firelight from some peasant's dying hearth. Still, they watched. Because that was the job, even when no one attacked, even when their fingers went numb, and their breath crusted their beards with frost. Castle night shifts were sometimes organized in what was called a vigilia, 3-hour watches divided throughout the night. A large castle might have several guards assigned per shift, rotating between outer walls, inner halls, and the lord's chambers. These weren't always professionals. Sometimes they were lower servants or laborers pulled into duty when tensions ran high. And they weren't alone. Shadows had company. Because the middle of the night was also when fears came out to stretch their legs. Medieval people believed that spirits, ghosts, and demons were most active between midnight and cockcrow, roughly 3 a.m. It was called the dead hour for a reason. If you woke during this time, especially with a sense of dread or weight on your chest, it wasn't dismissed as indigestion. It was considered a visitation. Castle halls didn't help. They echoed. Even a single rat skittering across the stone could sound like a thief. Wind moaned through arrow loops. Old beams creaked. And in older keeps, built on top of Roman ruins or older Norman foundations, the walls sometimes shifted at night, as if remembering something. One 14th-century castle steward in Burgundy kept a ledger of odd occurrences. The The guard at the south tower heard voices when none stood there. The candles in the chapel burned low despite being fresh. The hound of Lady Isabet growled at the corner where there was no man. They might not have believed it in daylight, but after midnight, belief wasn't the point. Meanwhile, inside the castle proper, movement continued in hushed tones. In the kitchens, a sleepy scullion stirred coals to keep embers ready for the morning's bread. A pot of broth hung above the ashes, thin but warm, meant for the steward's stomach if he awoke coughing again. Kitchen staff sometimes slept near their hearths in winter, and if they happened to nibble on a spare crust in the dark, well, no one asked. Somewhere above, in the ladies' chambers, soft voices echoed through the heavy curtains. Ladies in waiting and noble daughters shared beds, partly for heat, partly for company. They whispered, giggled, sometimes argued, sometimes cried. Night stripped away etiquette. The hard truths of love, fear, and aching feet all came out in the dark. If you were noble and lucky, you might have your own night servant, a woman or boy whose only job was to stay lightly asleep, near the fire, ready to fetch water, stoke the hearth, or help you to the privy without stepping barefoot on a cold rat. One castle's household record from 1359 lists 2 boys for the tending of candles and the ladies' chamber pot, rotating on alternate nights. A thankless job, mostly waiting in silence, listening for chamber bells or groans from behind tapestries. And yes, candles were managed closely. You didn't just light one and wonder. Candles were made of tallow, cheap but smoky, or beeswax if you were important. Both were expensive. Each night's usage was calculated. In larger households, a keeper of the wax was appointed. Especially in winter, they stored candles in locked boxes, cut them into regulated sizes, and recorded how long each burned. One account from the Bishop of Ely's household required his personal candle to be extinguished the moment he fell asleep, and not relit unless he be stirred by dreams of violent aspect. What exactly constituted a violent aspect was, apparently, subjective. And speaking of dreams, those who could sleep often didn't well. Beds, even grand ones, weren't soft. Lice were common, parasites were expected, everyone itched, wool blankets were warm but scratchy, linen sheets were smooth but rarely changed. The sheer discomfort kept people in a light doze rather than deep slumber. Some, especially those of religious temperament, took this wakefulness as a spiritual gift. Monks, after all, rose for matins in the middle of the night, often around 2 a.m. Castle chaplains occasionally did the same, chanting quiet prayers in cold chapels while their breath fogged before the altar. There's a recorded case from Warwick Castle where a chaplain, slipping into the chapel in the dead of night, discovered a page asleep on the stone floor. He had crept there from the barracks, he claimed, to escape the snores and fleas. The chaplain let him stay. Then, of course, there were the dungeons. Not every castle had them, and most that did used them more for storage than torture. But when occupied, the night in a dungeon was unimaginably grim. No windows, no torches, often no straw, just stone, cold, and the noises of your own breathing. If you were lucky, someone remembered your supper. A minor nobleman imprisoned in Rochester Castle in 1298 wrote in a letter, "The dark is a second cell, laid atop the first. I cannot feel time, I can only feel cold, chilling, and accurate." And still, despite the flickering dread, the half-sleeps and coughs, people survived the night. Night after night, season after season. How? Part of it was endurance, but part of it was ritual. Medieval people clung to routine like a raft in a storm. Prayers before sleep, beds made just so, candles trimmed with copper scissors, cloaks folded at the foot, shoes turned inward to keep away demons. We don't know if those rituals worked, but they gave the night a shape. And when the night was as dark and long as the ocean, shape was everything. By the time the first hint of dawn scraped across the narrow arrow-slit windows, the castle was already stirring, not with grace or ceremony, but with the slow, reluctant chaos of people waking up in a place where comfort was scarce, warmth was rationed, and privacy was theoretical. A rooster might crow in the courtyard, though more likely it would be drowned out by the groaning of hinges, the bark of dogs, and the collective muttering of servants with chapped hands and unfinished chores. Morning wasn't peaceful. It was procedural, and it started early. Painfully early. In the servant quarters, the lowest-ranking household members were expected to be up well before their masters. Some had slept on rush mats in kitchens, next to hearths that barely held any coals. Their blankets were shared. Their dreams, if any, were interrupted by rats, frost, or the elbow of someone rolling over too enthusiastically in the night. Now, in the blue-gray light of early morning, they moved through the castle barefoot, stiff, and half-silent, except for the clatter of buckets and the shiver of cold breath. The job list wasn't written down. It was memorized, the kind of memorization that came from repetition and a mild fear of being shouted at by someone higher up the feudal food chain. Water had to be fetched, often from a well in the courtyard, or, in more elaborate castles, from a cistern system. Either way, it was freezing. And heavy. Buckets sloshed over numb fingers. Slippery stone steps made every trip a gamble. Fires had to be relit. Ashes scraped out. The hearth in the great hall was usually the first priority, followed by the kitchen and the private chambers of the lord or lady. The firewood was kept in a storage shed or cellar, and it never felt like enough. Even when rationed, by March the piles had been reduced to damp, crooked sticks and a prayer. Then came the candles. They had to be trimmed, relit, replaced, or moved, according to status, need, and very specific household rituals. The keeper of the wax or candle servant was already tallying how many inches had burned the night before. Too much wax used without a justifiable reason, and someone would hear about it. Possibly from the steward, possibly from the lady of the house, possibly from God, if you were superstitious about wasted light, which many were. One 15th century manual on household management warned sternly, "Let no taper be left to melt unwatched, for fire and judgment may follow." It's unclear which was more fear. Meanwhile, upstairs the noble household began to murmur to life. There was no sleeping in. Not officially. If you were a nobleman or noblewoman, your waking was a small production. A servant, or sometimes a valet, would enter the chamber quietly, rake the fire, and light fresh candles if necessary. Then came the warm water in a basin. The lord or lady might wash their face and hands, possibly their teeth, if they followed the odd advice of certain medical texts that suggested cleaning the mouth with a linen rag dipped in salt and sage water. One diary from a lady at Caerphilly Castle mentions the daily scouring of the gums, with rosemary steeped in vinegar and the stiff brush of hog hair. Charming. Then came the dressing process. For nobles, this could take a while. Layer upon layer of linen, wool, silk if you were lucky, cloaks, hosen, undertunics, surcoats, each one meant to trap body heat or impress someone in the great hall, or both. Clothes had often been left close to the fire the night before, in hopes of not having to put on frozen wool at dawn. It didn't always work. Servants, by contrast, dressed fast and in silence. Their clothes were stiff, patched, and cold. They wore the same 2 or 3 garments every day, rotating based on necessity, not fashion. No one helped them. If your tunic had lice, that was your problem. Still, they dressed. And then they ran. The great hall was the castle's stomach. When it woke up, everything else followed. By sunrise, fires were roaring if possible, and trestle tables had been wiped down with soaked cloths that hadn't dried properly since yesterday. Benches were dragged into place. Salt was laid out, often in a decorative dish if the lord was wealthy. Dishes were brought out. Bread from the previous day was softened with ale or broth. Leftovers from last night's meal were reheated with varying degrees of success. This wasn't breakfast in the modern sense. This was breaking the night's fast with whatever was available: oatcakes, pottage, hard cheese, maybe eggs, if the hens hadn't frozen their productivity away. Meat was rare unless salted or left over from a feast day. And yet even this mundane chaos came with formality. Everyone had a place. Nobles sat at the high table. The steward might take a place of honor at the edge. Servants and guests sat lower, according to rank. Talking wasn't always allowed. Eating was done quickly, sometimes while standing. Hands were wiped on napkins or sleeves, depending on your rank and access to laundering. Somewhere in the mix, the gong farmer might be spotted, not actually farming anything, The gong farmer had the unenviable task of managing human waste. In castles, this meant collecting waste from privies, garderobes, and chamber pots, then carting it to designated pits, ideally outside the walls. In winter, these pits froze over. In spring, they thawed with vengeance. The job paid better than you'd think, mostly because no one else wanted to do it. The stench clung for days. There are records of gong farmers being forbidden from sleeping inside castle walls because of the smell, but they were vital. Without them, a castle could literally drown in its own waste. A 14th century complaint from Leeds Castle details a clogged garderobe chute that overflowed into the gallery chamber and offended the ladies' repose. Diplomatically put, and still, the day had only just begun. The castle, finally awake, shook off the night like a wet dog. Scribes sharpened quills, cooks prepared barley, pages polished armor that hadn't been used in weeks. Guards stretched, dogs barked. A pigeon fluttered madly into a window and was caught by a boy who hadn't eaten since yesterday. This was how morning began, not with poetry but with routine and frostbite, and an elbow in the ribs reminding you that you were still alive. So how did people survive castle nights? Maybe the better question is, how did they survive the mornings that followed? Because the real mystery isn't just how they stayed warm in the dark, but how they kept going once the cold, and the chores, and the smell of damp rushes came crashing back in with the light. What the darkness knew, and what morning forgot by mid-morning, the worst of the night had been scrubbed away, literally and figuratively. Ashes were shoveled from hearths, slop buckets were dumped, sometimes too close to doorways, chamber pots were rinsed, and the candles from the night before were trimmed or counted or silently mourned, depending on who paid for the wax. The people of the castle had survived the night again, as they always did, without celebration, without sleep, and often without fully understanding how. What they did understand, though, intimately, was that the rhythm of night and day was everything, not just as a natural cycle, but as a social architecture. Night in a medieval castle wasn't just a block of darkness, it was its own world. A strange liminal space where the hierarchy softened, habits broke down, and people became oddly, briefly, more human. In the dark, even the Lord's voice dropped in volume. Even the steward loosened his belt. Even the scribe set down his quill and let the candle go dim a little early. And in that space, a certain truth emerged. Castles weren't built for sleep. They were built for survival. The architecture gave it away. Towers weren't insulated. Rooms weren't designed to retain heat. The idea of comfort was always second to defense. A castle could repel an army, but not a February wind. As the scholar Matthew Johnson once noted, medieval castles communicated status but rarely improved living conditions. Their walls were thick, but their drafts were patient, which is why people didn't trust the building to keep them alive. They trusted each other, noble or peasant, soldier or steward. The trick to surviving a castle night wasn't better architecture. It was shared knowledge. They knew which rooms stayed warmest, which rushes molded the slowest, which beds harbored lice, and which only smelled like they did. They knew how to hang a cloak over a broken shutter, how to rub onion on a cough, and how to fall asleep while someone next to you whispered the same prayer every night at the same point in the creaking darkness, because the rituals mattered, even the odd ones, like tucking a scrap of holy verse under your pillow, or turning your shoes upside down to keep ghosts from tracing your footsteps back into bed, or placing a knife under the cradle to ward off night hags. These weren't just superstitions, they were small acts of control in a world where control was scarce. Even how people slept followed a rhythm we've mostly forgotten. Rather than a single long stretch, many followed what's called segmented sleep, two shorter phases broken by an hour or two of wakefulness. In that middle hour, people prayed, talked, whispered, wrote, or depending on circumstances, did less devotional things under the blankets. One 15th century French physician wrote that the first sleep prepares the humors, the second completes the soul. Medical logic or medieval poetry? Hard to say. And yet, for all the discomfort, people weren't necessarily miserable. That's the part modern minds struggle with. We assume that cold, dark, crowded nights were endured with clenched teeth and silent suffering, but to the people who lived them, it was just life. Not worse, just different. There were pleasures, the crackle of a hearth finally catching, the quiet after a snowfall. The warmth of someone pressed close, not for love necessarily, but for heat. The smell of rushes newly laid, the candle flame dancing on a ceiling beam like it had a mind of its own. Even laughter, especially laughter, found its way into the dark. People told stories before sleep. Jokes, often ribald, traveled across straw mats and stone floors. In some castles, a fool or minstrel was expected to entertain in the evening, not just for festivity, but to soften the fear that came with the dark. According to an account from Durham Castle, one fool named Peter was kept near the fire to cheer the household with nonsense and good singing, until all were at rest or drunk enough not to mind the wind. That may be the most honest job description in medieval history. The night was also when castles were most honest. In daylight, protocol ruled, rank was enforced, ceremony reigned. But at night, people unbuttoned, literally and socially. The lady of the house might whisper complaints about the steward. The cook might confess to stealing extra bacon grease for her sore foot. The squire might admit he was afraid of thunder. None of it mattered in the morning. In the morning, the castle remembered its place, but the night remembered something else. Still, not everyone made it to dawn. In bad winters, bodies were discovered cold and stiff on straw beds. Children, especially, were vulnerable. The old, too, and the sick. The records mention them bluntly, died in the night, written in Latin, repeated like a sigh. There were no medical miracles, only warmth, chance, and faith, and blankets. As many as you could find, and yet the mystery isn't how they died. It's how so many didn't. Because somehow, despite the poor insulation, the shared air, the rats, the ghosts, and the cough that never really went away, medieval people lived through those nights, again and again, decade after decade, century after century. They stitched together lives from thin fires and thick routines. They hoarded warmth and jokes. They turned superstition into comfort, discomfort into rhythm, and rhythm into survival. So yes, how people survived medieval castle nights is a mystery. But like most mysteries, it's not unsolvable. It's just human. They survived because they adapted, because they leaned on each other, because they shared stories, fears, and straw beds, because they figured out where the wind blew hardest and built around it, because they learned the tricks, how to hang wool near a fire without setting it alight, how to sleep in shifts, how to breathe quietly when the wind moaned just a little too much like a voice, and maybe because, on some level, they understood what we often forget, that night doesn't last, and sometimes that's all you need to get through it.